In 1995, Taito Corporation released Psychic Force in arcades as the premier game for the Taito FX1. The FX1 was only one of Taito's many short-lived arcade boards, and only had a few games released for it. But whereas the board's successors would host mainly fighting games and shoot-'em-ups, its premier game was a combination of those two genres. By combining the spacing and projectile-based aspects of shooters with the technical quirks of fighting games, Taito developed a hybrid that was unique at the time, one which broke ground for a new niche altogether. And considering that it spawned an OVA, comic tie-ins, puzzle spin-offs, and a sequel, back when making a sequel was a direct response to consumer interest, I'd say that it was a hit in its own right, so that's an excellent place to start. Psychic Force does a good job of working with its premise. The plot is basically what a Madhouse adaptation of X-Men made in the 90s would be like, where psychics fight in midair, locked in psionic cubes. And the game features character designs drawn by Tsukasa Kado, an artist who has the chops for designing characters that are easy to read from a distance. This all gels smoothly, as the character designs make it easy to pick out a character's position and state while still using flashy and distinct projectiles, while the cubes players fight in are their own stages within the stages, allowing the eye candy to be as gimmicky as it wants, while the only thing the players have to worry about are the actual invisible walls. Psychickers, as the game calls them, are the only ones that can see and feel the cubes. The latter point is key. Not because a wireframe cube floating in midair with no one else commenting on it would break one's suspension of disbelief, but because movement is a key part of the game, and making the stages uniform in function puts movement at the forefront. That was even one of the selling points for the original arcade release. Taito hyped up its full 360-degree motion, which is technically correct. And the key to winning matches in Psychic Force is keeping your bearings while staying in motion. Psychic Force's gameplay is based in a three-dimensional space, but with two-dimensional controls and inputs. Because the characters are enveloped by the arena and levitate in the air, they can move freely, but the game handles this in a different fashion than most others. When moving normally, the only points of reference that the fighters have are each other and the walls that surround them, so they can move towards, away from, and around each other, rather than up, down, left, and right. Each fighter has a life bar and a psycho gauge, the latter of which is used to perform special moves. The basic controls involve an 8-way input, joystick, analog, D-pad, what have you, and 3 buttons, A, B, and C. When you move to a set distance away from your opponent, buttons A and B act as basic projectile attacks. The light projectile tracks the opponent at startup and moves very quickly. The heavy projectile is slower, but it can be aimed in different directions independent of where the opponent currently is. And every character has special moves that act as unique projectiles, with their own special properties, performed with conventional motions. When you move in close, the camera closes in and the A and B buttons switch to different striking attacks. A becomes a light strike, while B becomes a heavy strike. These strikes can be chained and combined into a handful of short, preset combinations, although they can only be chained from light to heavy. That is to say, you can't go from light to heavy and then back to light again. By pressing the C button, you can block damage from attacks, although you have to stay in place to do so, and most strong attacks will push you back. Players can also dash by pressing A and B together. A neutral press causes characters to make a quick dash towards the opponent, while pressing A, B, and a direction causes them to move in that same direction during what's called a normal dash, independent of their opponent, which keeps Taito's advertising honest. That's the catch, I imagine. You have all 3 dimensions available to you, but you can only use 2 at a time. And by pressing A, C, and a direction, you can grab opponents when they're close. Now, like I said before, movement is key. That's because most of the basic mechanics are built around spacing, and most of the special moves are based around bypassing those mechanics at the cost of meter. All basic attacks are context sensitive, based on how far away you are from your opponent, so it's obviously important to move into the range you need for the attack that you want. Also, because basic attacks don't track the opponent, and most special moves only track the opponent at startup. Sometimes the simplest way to get around them is to just move out of the way. Special moves generally aren't context sensitive, but they each have their own uses and quirks, and generally work at different ranges. And with either type of attack, most exchanges will involve moving past someone else's attack while using your own. Because of this, directional inputs in Psychic Force work differently than how they do in more traditional fighting games. Simply moving around, for example, is simple, because all of the inputs are registered independently of your character's position on screen. There's very little chance of unintentionally moving past someone while you're just floating around. And special moves don't really require you to start from the character's perspective. For example, if a special move requires you to tap in 2 opposing directions and then press A or B, you can tap up down up, right left, opposing diagonals, and so on. Or if you need to execute a half circle for a special move, the inputs can come from left to down to right, or down left to down right to up right, or any such motion, so long as the general motion is the same. And the same rules apply to normal dashing, even with the independent movement used in directional dashing. This is important because, like other fighting games with dashes, special moves can be buffered into the dash during its animation, and then executed once the animation is finished. The same could be said for strikes as well, but there's a little delay between the end of a normal dash and the strike that follows, which suggests that the strike starts after the dash is completely over. Quick dashes are almost the opposite of that. You can't throw out specials right at the end of them, but they can be cancelled with strikes or grabs. They even throw up a small barrier as the character approaches that clashes with weak projectiles. And normal dashes can be cancelled into quick dashes as well. But even though movement is such an important part of both attacking your opponent and keeping yourself safe, it always carries a level of risk. The more you move, the more vulnerable you are. That's why guarding is still important too. Although it forces you to stand in place, it guarantees that so long as you guard properly, you won't take any damage from an attack. It does force players to face one direction for as long as the guard button is held, which leaves them open to attack from their side or from behind. But dropping one's guard and then raising it again realigns the player's line of sight. There's also an auto guard function, which allows you to block automatically by leaving the stick neutral, but it can only be used a set number of times, although it can be adjusted in settings. The default is usually 10, like most other fighters that have this feature. I'd argue that this is one of the few game series where an auto guard feature is actually useful, but it still suffers from the same drawbacks that manual guarding does, most notable of which is pushback. Any attack that is guarded causes at least some pushback. The stronger the attack, the farther back a character is pushed when said character blocks it, and the character's weight generally determines how far back they're pushed. Auto guard is most affected by pushback because it activates whenever an attack hits while the player is in neutral, which means that the player using it needs to avoid wasting auto blocks and being forced into the corner. Honestly, if you need to be conscious of blocking anyway, it kinda defeats the purpose of having automatic blocking to begin with. Anyway, the danger of pushback lies in the fact that making hard contact with the cube causes significant damage and leaves you floating prone, a type of stun state that lasts for about a second. While most attacks can't knock you into a wall, hard strikes can, and the stun can be followed up with a second attack, a grab, or a short combo chain, although players can't be stunned twice in a row. If you're knocked back into the wall a second time, the feedback from the wall knocks your character unconscious and forces a fall towards the bottom of the cube until they recover. Beyond basic guarding, there are also 2 stronger types of guarding that can be used: barrier guard and evasion barrier. Unlike normal and quick dashes, however, these defensive options cost meter. Barrier guarding is activated by entering a 360 motion with the joystick before pressing guard. This creates a barrier around you as you guard, and the barrier absorbs some of the impact from attacks. In fact, if the other player makes contact with the barrier, it will knock him or her back instead. Since the inputs are set up to be similar to fighting games, a 270 motion can also be used to activate the barrier instead. Also, barrier guarding can be used to cancel the latter part of any hit animation that leaves the player using it stunned or lying prone. The barrier drains the psycho gauge though, and it does so until you either drop your guard or run out of psycho energy. The psycho gauge replenishes by itself over time, but it can also be charged by pressing all 3 buttons at once, although charging manually leaves fighters vulnerable to attack. The evasion barrier is performed by tapping 2 opposite directions and pressing guard while your character is sent flying, and its main use is to avoid the stun caused by slamming into the wall. It takes 40% of the psycho gauge to pull it off, and if the guard button is held down, it turns into a barrier guard and continues to consume energy at a slower pace. As for the special moves I've been prattling on about, they're the main draw on a player's psycho energy, and they take set percentages of energy from the gauge. Most special moves in this game have the same risk-reward aspect to them as other fighting games. Weaker special moves cost less and are easier to perform, while the strongest moves have the most complicated inputs and take longer to execute. However, there are a few neat quirks that the game uses which come from its shooter aspects. First, stronger attacks can usually nullify or move around weaker ones. Second, and more importantly, the stronger attacks in the game act like boss attacks from classic shoot-'em-ups. In addition to dishing out big damage, they also have all sorts of different arcs of movement and abilities. Genma, for example, can lay mines with his spell tags, or summon large, slow-moving ogres that can prevent his opponents from using certain sections of the arena, while Wendy can launch waves of wind that can swing through from the side, or cast a tornado that can take up a huge section of the space that's directly in front of her. In fact, almost all of the strongest attacks are extravagant, screen-filling affairs, save for Wong, who does his best Dio Brando impression. If you have enough energy, you can even link some of the special moves together and effectively lock down huge swaths of the screen. Overall, the first entry in the Psychic Force series is an interesting hybrid game, and it accomplishes what Taito or any other arcade developer would want to do with a game for a brand new board. It shows off the board's power and offered something novel to its players. Furthermore, the game is relatively easier to understand than other fighting games, or some of its contemporary shooting game peers for that matter, which makes it fairly easy to learn. Psychic Force didn't do so well in US arcades, but it was actually a small hit in Japan, and to follow up on the game's success, Taito released an update to the game called Psychic Force EX. I can't actually find a version of the game that runs cleanly. Most of the cabs that I come across are busted in one way or another, and I've heard that there are problems running it otherwise. But I heard that the changes boiled down to adding new color schemes for the characters, tweaking a few characters, and making small changes to the time unlock requirements for the secret characters. Sometime after EX's release, Taito put out a PlayStation port of the game in 1996, as well as a Bubble Bobble spin-off called Psychic Force Puzzle Taisen in 1998, and an OVA series named Psychic Force, one of many fighting game OVAs made in the 90s to promote their respective series. One of the few upsides of the Psychic Force OVAs was that they were made alongside the other cross-media productions, so it sticks to the overall gist of the game instead of making up a bunch of details that would become stumbling blocks down the line for fandom at large. That's how I see it anyway, but that's not the important thing though. That's side stuff. The important thing is that the Japanese port of Psychic Force, the game, was solid, save for a few tweaked features here and there and a good chunk of loading. It was handled by Taito in-house, and it had a few extra features such as alternate game modes and the ability to use the Pocket Station, which I'm sure most people know by now is a little trinket they had that interconnected with the PlayStation in order to unlock various things. And it was used to receive and transmit ranking data. The US port, on the other hand, was handled by Acclaim, who made a few odd choices here and there, but nothing too drastic. The aforementioned Pocket Station stuff was removed, but it had to be because Sony had no plans to put it out in the States. The other stuff is the odd part. The main thing that stands out is the dubbing, which was infrequent. Cutscenes and wind quotes were spoken in English, but the battle cries during a fight were left in their native Japanese, which was unusual for the time, and unusual in general.
Your power is too strong, and though you are just a boy, I cannot let your power go unchecked.
Don't waste your time. Not even I can control this power.
Ready? Go!
Sorry about that.
Good man.
After the home port of the original Psychic Force was released, Taito released a proper sequel in 1998 named Psychic Force 2012. It takes place about 2 years after the events of the first game, and made some interesting changes to the surviving cast, while introducing some new blood which would eventually be plastered all over the place. Taito also added a few new moves to the basic moveset, and made some changes to the existing engine, which was brought over from the first game. First, Taito changed how the basic projectiles worked. Heavy projectiles would now take energy from the Psycho gauge, and if the gauge ran low, it would default to the light projectile. Second, they added the hypercharge. By performing a 360 motion while charging psi energy, you can expand a character's Psycho gauge by draining some of their health gauge. There are no major restrictions for the move, and it can be performed at any time during the match. Furthermore, as you lose health, you gain more space for your Psycho energy, and on top of that, the two gauges have now been joined as one. Third, they added the slide dash. By tapping two opposite directions and A and B, you perform a sidestep of sorts. Oddly enough, you can't always control the direction you step in. If it goes one direction, like left, then the second time you do it, it'll go in the other direction, right. And finally, they introduced two new defensive and offensive moves, Psi Impulse and Barrier Break. Psi Impulse is activated by tapping A or B during hit stun. It acts like a simpler version of the post-stun evasion barrier in the original Psychic Force, and costs about 25% of the Psi gauge. Barrier Break is performed by pressing the joystick towards the opponent and hitting B, which can break a barrier guard, but can itself be blocked by a regular guard. Between the original Psychic Force and Psychic Force 2012, I'd have to say that I prefer 2012. It adds enough to justify itself as a sequel, and improves on the original game's strengths. The changes to the balance between life and meter adds all sorts of variables into a match, and changes the flow of the game based on what each player is willing to risk as the rounds go on. And I think that even with the new mechanics that were introduced, the game keeps most of its simplicity intact. 2012 was less of a success than its predecessor, but Taito ported it to a few systems as well. The first port was an arcade-perfect transfer for the Dreamcast, as the original version of 2012 was on the Naomi board, while the second was an adjusted port for the PlayStation 1, retitled Psychic Force 2. The latter had longer loading times and less detailed backgrounds and models, but it came with characters that were cut from the original version of the game, and additional game modes. In addition, Taito used 2012's game engine and some of its assets to make a game based on the X television series, which was published and released by Bandai in 2002 for the PlayStation 1. The fundamental fighting mechanics are one-to-one with 2012, although the overall style is obviously quite different. Well, maybe I shouldn't say obviously. Clamp hasn't had its day for a while now, so I imagine not too many people are familiar with X anymore. To be just a bit more specific, the X TV series is its own thing, and the perk that I mentioned earlier about Psychic Force character design doesn't really apply here. While the characters from the series stand out from each other, and introduce some interesting gimmicks based on their designs and abilities, their colors and clothing don't really work with the stages, especially when the characters dressed in all black show up on stages with dark lighting. The game is still solid though, and I'm sure Clamp fans were satisfied with it overall. Years later, in 2006, Taito released a compilation of the series titled Psychic Force Complete on the PlayStation 2. That's the version I'm using at the moment. It included the PlayStation 1 port of the original Psychic Force, the Dreamcast port of Psychic Force 2012, and Psychic Force 2012 EX, an adjusted version of 2012 that includes the characters which were missing from the arcade and Dreamcast versions. They fit in fairly well in the sequel, just like they did in Psychic Force 2, because Taito had the good sense to set up their moves with the same mechanics and limitations as the original 2012 roster, rather than allowing or forcing them to use the same rules that they had in Psychic Force Classic. You know, it's been 4 years to the day since I started playing Psychic Force. I had intended to get this video out by December of 2011, but I had convinced myself that I was engaging in humbug, that I was more concerned with listening to myself prattle on about how solid the game is instead of actually playing it and figuring out whether it was solid or not. Having this video out finally takes the weight off my shoulders, but at the same time, I've missed out on so many opportunities to point out that we don't fight in giant wireframe cubes in 2012, let alone 2015. Live and learn. In any case, you won't have to wait 4 years for the next video. I'll be covering Plasma Sword, aka Star Gladiator 2, next week. I guarantee it.